Welcome back to the show, everyone. I'm joined here today with Emily Walsh Martin. Emily's a principal at Tremont Therapeutics Consulting. Excited to be talking today about what we all saw, heard, and learned from the American Society of Gene and Cell Therapies Policy Summit. The lineup was incredible, and as advertised, there's just a ton of content to cover in our conversation with Emily today, including one-on-one conversations with Nicole Verdun, the brand new director of FDA's Office of Therapeutic Products, and Laura McWright from the Centers for Medicaid and Medicare Innovation. Now, if you missed out on attending live in Washington, D.C., or maybe you're just hearing about the ASGCT's Policy Summit, you can still register and watch the entire event on demand through October 19th. As a reminder, the Policy Summit connects attendees with leaders and decision makers throughout the regulatory, policy, and government relations world. The perspectives and insights that were discussed at the ASGCT's Policy Summit inform the regulatory, legislative, and payment policies that will impact cell and gene therapy development. Check out the full program and register online to see all that great on-demand content at asgct.org/policy summit. Or you can also check out the show notes for the link. So thanks for joining the podcast today, Emily. Let's dive right in, and maybe we could start with you sharing your history with attending the Policy Summit and what brings you back to this conference year after year.
Yeah, so it's a great question. It's funny when I talk about ASGCT, I certainly talk about the annual meeting, of course, but it's the Policy Summit that I'm doing the hard sell on with all of my colleagues. My first time attending, I think, was 2019, just have every year gotten so much out of this summit because it takes topics that I've approached as a program manager, helping teams navigate, from the lab into the clinic for the first time, and sort of spins them around and gives you the full view of what you have to do to ultimately get that product to a patient's hands. Oftentimes with drug development in cell and gene therapy, your first trial becomes a heavy part of your dossier for making the case that you're ready to get market authorization. And so you almost have to start thinking about access issues and patient needs before you even start your first in human, because those threads will continue your entire development path. And so for me, I attend this summit every year because I literally learn something new that impacts what I'm thinking about even before IND sometimes for my clients.
Such a great point, and you're absolutely right. Throughout the conference, there was a lot to dive into to learn how early in the process you really need to start to be thinking, even commercially, around reimbursement and things. And I know we're going to get into lots of this. There was so much content this year. What was your favorite session?
So I think I had the same feeling as other attendees that last session, the patient access to CGT's realities on the ground, was like the highlight of the conference. And in part, every year the ASGCT has a session like this where they bring together people who have the patient view, people who have the payer view, people who have the policy view, and clinicians to sort of discuss all the handoffs that need to successfully occur to ultimately be able to treat a patient. And it again reinforces how small decisions that you make, even as early as IND, can have a major impact on the likelihood of success that after market authorization, your product gets into the hands of the people that need it the most.
Well, maybe just were there other key takeaways from that session that you'd want to highlight?
Yeah, I think the other interesting part of that whole session was, and this is a benefit of having these all now on demand, because you can go back and you can listen to the two sessions sort of side by side and compare and contrast what you're hearing from different folks. But for instance, in that session, it was John Fiore from the Institute of Gene Therapies was started to talk about the initiatives that are going on in the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, the CMMI, and his sort of slightly different view about the complexities of trying to be a single negotiator for all the states around certain elements of reimbursement. And so it was very interesting to me to be able to, go back and forth and listen to what was Laura McWright saying in her session versus John Fiore in his session, and how, frankly, there are small details about how healthcare works in the U.S. and how reimbursement works in the U.S. that seem for many classes of drugs, like small molecules, to be, details, like nothing to get too overly concerned about. But for cell and gene therapy, they have huge impacts. And so it's really interesting to hear the experts peel this apart from their specific perspectives, and sort of reveal that the complexities of, hey, it sounds great to have one-stop shopping for a Medicaid conversation instead of having to go to each of the 50 states in turn. But what are the complexities of that? So it was, for me, that's a session I will probably go back to again and again to try and understand how that policy sort of evolves over time.
Well, Emily, let's stay with that theme for a moment, because I agree with you. That conversation with Laura McWright from the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Innovation, she outlined the three models that the agency's focused on, of course, one of them being their ongoing effort with the Cell and Gene Therapy Access Model. Can you maybe describe what that model is and what were some of the highlights from that session?
Well, I think she pointed out something interesting, right? So typically, the position a manufacturer is in is, at the point of authorization, having to go sort of state by state and have conversations and say, for instance, for our, cell or gene therapy, we want to structure this as a success payment, or we want to structure this as you pay up front, but if we don't continue to have efficacy at time point X, we're gonna pay you back. All of those conversations, in theory, folks are now having to have one-on-one across all the states. Some of those states are going to have more or less comfort based on their populations with those types of innovative approaches that may be perfectly appropriate for our cell and gene therapies. And some are going to be perfectly comfortable with them. And so the challenge is that if you're a patient that happens to live in a state that has either a population that doesn't lend itself to that kind of structure, or just a state that doesn't have the experience of negotiating on this, there may be a slower path to access for those patients in that state as a result. And so I in theory, really liked what Laura was saying about trying to have some sort of clearinghouse, some sort of central concept that could help the state sort of unify the approach and simplify things. On the other hand, that does create other complexities of the negotiation process. And so it'll be interesting to see how that evolves over time. And obviously, Laura wasn't able to give us any details on this. She sort of begged our patience multiple times in her comments that, she's really not going to have more to say until 2024. She kept using the term heads down, which I appreciated. But it will be important for us to watch that, I think, as an industry and understand its impacts.
Great. So just to summarize there, what we heard was stay tuned for those who are in, developing novel cell and gene therapies. Stay tuned for more guidance on that model, access model in 2024, right?
Right.
Let's back up for a minute Emily. And this summit actually kicked off with a fireside chat with the new head of the Office of Therapeutic Products at FDA, Nicole Verdun. What were your key takeaways from this discussion, this fireside chat?
So again, this is another sort of element of all the ASGCTs, a lot of fireside chats with folks who are going to play sort of pivotal roles in our industry as we move forward. And so Nicole's comments were amazing. First of all, I was incredibly impressed with her background and experience in the field, and also her experience within the FDA in a number of different roles before being in this role. I think she highlighted a lot of the challenges that the companies are facing as they try to move products forward. One is that, there's a lot of activity here and the office needs to grow in order to be able to manage the workflow, right? And I think all of us have felt the growing pains, and she acknowledged this regarding, people coming up to speed as they've just been hired into the office, and then maybe not always being able to have a conversation, maybe getting a lot more written responses rather than actual meetings, and how she's hoping to sort of steer the office towards being able to really scale and deal with the large number of products that are coming through. I think, though, for me, the most interesting part that she commented on was the accelerated approval concept. And for me, this is one of the things that I think everyone has been struggling with. The benefits, obviously, of an accelerated approval based on a biomarker that's expected to portend a clinical benefit, obviously holds a lot of interest from sponsors because that gets them to patients in theory, or at least authorized to be administered to patients more quickly. The challenge is the gap between that and, let's say a full acceptance by the payers and those who reimburse the product. Additionally, there's that gap between a novel biomarker that we think actually should portend good results from a clinical perspective, and then those results actually showing up at the end. And sometimes it can be, years difference. You see something in a circulating biomarker at year one that looks great, but then, you really have to wait, 2, 3, 4, 5 years to understand if that change in biomarker really did make a difference in terms of the clinical outcome for that patient. It's one of those things that cuts both ways, where, again, like it'd be great to get accelerated approval on the one hand, but on the other hand, if that complicates the reimbursement conversations, if that complicates access, it's sort of hard to know what to do. So I appreciated that she sort of got the nuance of that right off the bat. I don't think like she has all the answers. I don't think anyone has all the answers for how to navigate this. But it's important that we keep talking about it so that we can figure out the best path.
Well, Emily, before we close on sort of the policy side of the meeting here with the regulators, I think one area that I know I was interested about in that discussion was a discussion around future regulatory models and the use of platform designations. Because that in many ways is an enabling, like that will help accelerate development of novel gene therapies. What is your take on that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in my career, I've definitely worked at platform type companies and worked with clients who have platform type assets. And I think the devil's always in the details on that of from a regulatory point of view. Do I have a platform that really is sort of cut and paste, plug and play for every next indication or sub-indication that I'm going to pursue. And a lot of that depends on the sort of risk benefit of the next indication, the similarity in expectations for efficacy and so forth. It's funny. I think she was definitely promoting this. It'll be interesting to see how many products truly sort of, I guess, benefit from a platform designation. Certainly, you can imagine a scenario where you have a monogenic disease with multiple different mutations that can cause it, and maybe you have to have slightly different, constructs or payloads to address each of those different sort of sub indications under the same heading. And that one makes sense to me. Very obviously, that's a platform play. On the other hand, if you're going after, two different monogenic diseases, but with the same, let's say, AAV serotype and the same route of administration, you could still have very, very different risk benefits or very, very different sort of efficacy expectations for a lot of different reasons. So for me, I feel like that's a watch and wait. It'd be great if it's useful more broadly, but it'll be interesting to see how narrow the agency ultimately perceives the platform designation approach.
Well, Emily, one of my favorite parts of the conference was really those sessions with the patient focus. And I know that there was a session on patient-focused development, and Mary Dwight from the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation really provided a nice snapshot of patient empowerment from the perspective of these cystic fibrosis patients. What about that discussion resonated with you?
Yeah, I feel the same way. I very much appreciate the opportunity to listen to patient and patient advocates talk sort of brass tacks about what it's like for patients with these indications. For me, Mary commented a lot about the sort of pre-competitive space that the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation was able to really be a true leader in for all the products that have sort of moved forward in cystic fibrosis. I think she mentioned something like, every marketed product like Cystic Fibrosis Foundation has had some level of a hand in helping to advance. And I think that's fantastic. I think they were able to anticipate a lot of the regulatory needs and sort of build out efforts to have registries and these kinds of things that really helped sponsors to be successful as they navigated development for that disease. I think the one thing that they also mentioned in that discussion, I can't remember if it was Mary or part of the panel discussion afterwards, was the concept of patient data, right? So, and this is something I've been passionate about for a while. In theory, you're as a sponsor, you run your clinical trial. We're meant to follow people, for whatever the duration of the first trial, and then typically, you roll them over into a long-term follow-up to fill out your regulatory responsibilities to follow for 5 years, for instance, for a gene therapy. And I would say that at this point, we've got a lot of programs that have started many, many years ago, and yet not a ton of data that's emerging yet on the long-term follow-up from those studies. And for me, what I was thinking during that panel discussion is the comments about, well, in theory, yes, the sponsor owns those data, but on the other hand, it's actually the patient's data. And so I think the one thing that resonated for me was the concept of what do we owe patients? Because they are, for instance, giving up their one shot on goal, right? By joining our trials, by being part of our protocols, especially for AAV today, with a lack of a clear path for redosing, this is probably their chance. And so I think one of the things we may need to think about as an industry is what are our obligations in return? And I would say at a minimum, it's sort of continued public disclosure of long-term data so that the entire field can understand what's working, what's not working, what are the learnings, even if it's not in the same indication, even if it's in a, adjacent indication, there's a lot we're still learning from each other. And the long-term data coming out of these trials is an important part of that. And maybe we need to do a little better.
So Emily, you mentioned, the ongoing challenges with patient access to many of these novel cell and gene therapies. And I know those of us working in the space are passionate about getting these breakthrough therapies to patients and ensuring access. So during the summit, there were several sessions where experts really talked about access and reimbursement challenges and policy developments. And so can you maybe summarize what were the highlights from these sessions?
Yeah, I think I'll again, direct folks to that last session and Michael's story from Nationwide Children's Hospital, because he's sort of one of these people that has to be one of the more challenging roles, right? In the pipeline of everything that has to happen to get a drug to a patient, he's sort of that last step in the process of helping them navigate reimbursement. And I don't know, I just got to send people back to that session and ask them to listen, because the complexities of choices that we make during development and the impacts they have on his ability to do his job later are huge. I feel like I should leave a little mystery there and force people just to go back and listen.
Yeah, there was a lot to unpack in that session, and it makes reimbursement sound exciting again. I know there were sessions I would direct listeners to the coding and reimbursement session as well. That was part of that because it's really informative around how cell and gene therapies, all the coding and how it's tied to reimbursement. So I would definitely suggest people check out those sessions.
Well, and I think the other part of that, right, is in the coding session, you really get to pick apart like the different aspects of all the steps involved, right? So there can be a procedural code, there can be the drug code, all of these things that you have to think about in advance. It's a lot, and sometimes there are small things you can do early on in a trial that's going to make life easier for you down the line in that regard.
So just as we wrap up here, Emily, are there any other highlights from the policy summit that you'd like to share?
The only thing I would say there is that honestly, and I say this a lot, but I trained as a researcher. I moved into pharma and biotech as a program manager and a program leader. And most of my work is basically on cross-functional teams, sort of moving things from development candidate into the clinic for the first time. And I attend this summit every year because for me to do my job of helping a cross-functional team move things into the clinic, I feel like I need to be aware of these topics and how they may impact choices we make as a team. And sometimes, you can't sort of trim the sails early on in a product development to address some of these things. But I think if we're trying to do the best by patients, we can't afford to lose track of them, even if it's not something you can implement, during phase one. It's something that needs to be on the team's mind. And so I encourage, everyone on my teams, whether they're, in CMC or they're in research, like this is an important summit to at least give you an entry-level view of all the complex issues involved.
Well, Emily, I want to thank you for your insights and recap of this excellent policy summit. There was so much to talk about. We only scratched the surface, so I would just invite everyone to check out the ASGCT website. There's still time to register, and listen to the sessions on demand. So again, thanks, Emily, for spending the time with us today.
Absolutely happy to be here.